Welcome to Real Money, Real Experts, a podcast where leading financial counseling and coaching experts share their stories, their challenges, and their advice for helping people manage money in the real world. I'm your host, Rachel DeLeon, Executive Director of the Association for Financial Counseling and Planning Education, or AFCPE.
And I'm your co-host, Dr. Mary Bell Carlson, an accredited financial counselor, or AFC, and the president of Financial Behavior Keynote Group. Every episode, we're taking a deep dive in the topics that personal finance professionals care about, helping clients, building community, and your professional growth. Today, our guest is Mike Kothakota. He is the head of research at the CFP Board. Mike develops and conducts studies to examine client outcomes for the public. He creates research to identify industry trends and leads business intelligence at the CFP Board. He also develops new research and resources for CFP practitioners. Before his appointment at CFP Board, Mike was a financial planning practitioner for 17 years, working at a large regional firm for 3 years, and he is currently the CEO of Wolfbridge Wealth, a Raleigh-based financial planning RIA firm. Mike has provided consulting services to financial technology company Bento Inc., Income Lab, and PenFin. He's also a partner of the data science from DataTracks, where he provided data science consulting to government organizations, nonprofits, and small businesses. In addition, he has taught financial planning and wealth management courses at Kansas State University, the University of Georgia, and Columbia University. Mike is a Tillman Scholar, and he holds a Master of Science in Predictive Analytics from Northwestern University and a PhD in Financial Planning from Kansas State University. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. Mike, thanks so much for taking the time to come on today's show. Tell us a little bit about your personal journey into this field. How did you get into financial planning and research in financial planning?
My origin story is a little interesting. At least I think it's interesting. Maybe not other people don't. But when I was in 8th grade, I took a home economics class, and it had a list of occupations and what the expected salaries were. And the top of this particular list, for some reason, was biochemist. And so I decided that that's what I was going to do. And so I went to school for biochemistry. I did fairly well in my classes, but my instructors actually got me a job at the National Institutes of Health as a research assistant. And it turns out I did not like lab work. And so I was kind of lost for a little while. And I took one of those little quizzes that they give you at the career centers at universities. And the first 9 categories were healthcare related, nurse, physician, EMT, etc. And then number 10 was financial planner. And I actually didn't know anything about financial planning, didn't know what financial planning was, never heard of it. I mean, obviously, I'd heard of accountants and CPAs, but had not heard of that. And I thought, well, okay, well, then that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do that instead. I quit my job at NIH, and I was working in security management while I was finishing up school. The problem there is I kept getting promoted, and it kept delaying my entry into the field. And then about 2003, my National Guard unit was activated to go to Iraq. So I had about 15 months, actually it was closer to 20 months if you include train up, 20 months away from my job. And so I had that distance and was able to gain some perspective on, am I ever going to really do this thing where I go become a financial planner? And when I came back, I quit my job and applied at a number of firms and got hired on at Edward Jones, actually. And I stayed there for 3 years and then started my own firm, 2008, 2009. Perfect timing. Mm-hmm. For those listening who don't remember what that was like, it was pretty rough, and financial services probably not the best type of business to start, but I did and survived. And once, our income stabilized, I was able to, think about what I was going to do with the rest of my GI Bill. And I went back to school to get I thought, well, I want to do something different. So let me do this predictive analytics thing. I've always been interested in math and data. But when I was younger, I was told I wasn't really good at it. So turns out, I know. Isn't that weird? Turns out with the right instruction and the right motivation, you can overcome some of that. The other thing, my art teacher told me that I drew something one time, and she said that I was the worst artist she'd ever seen. Isn't it terrible?
No way.
So yeah, it turns out I'm pretty good at it. And I thought, well, I'll integrate this into my practice and figure out better ways to, optimize not only the business, but just how I deliver services. And then I was going to give the rest of my GI Bill to my daughter, and then they changed the law, said you had to re-enlist. My wife said no. So also, I said no. I said no. My body said no for sure. So I went back to school to get the PhD in financial planning from Kansas State, and I refined my research skills. I was able to learn a lot more about theory, a lot more about constructing, research design, constructing research projects, asking research questions. Since then, I fell in love with research. So it's the thing that sings to me. It's the thing that motivates me and gives me purpose.
Mike, your story is really interesting because you've held so many different positions and done various things. But I like the fact that you've seen financial services from both the ground level, but also at a bird's eye view for several years in the various positions you've had. You've also been in various fields from financial planning, financial counseling, financial therapy. So I'd like you to talk a bit more about what it looks like to build an integrated continuum of personal finance. Like, do you have to only be a financial planner, or how can you become more integrated as both a counselor and a planner?
You know what I did miss in that bio? I actually got my AFC before I became a CFP. One of the reasons I did that is because during the crisis, and I promise I'll answer your question, but one of the reasons I did that was a lot of the people who came to me during the financial crisis were people who were going through divorce, and they needed help with determining what their life was going to look like after post divorce, what it was going to look like during divorce, how they were going to finance the divorce. And it turned out that the attorneys themselves, while they were very skilled in the law, they knew the rules, but they didn't know, what the downstream effects were. And I did not have, any sort of skills to cope with working with people who were in this really vulnerable state and who were in this, they had this very traumatic thing happen. And I thought, well, it looks like maybe I need some counseling skills. And then a lot of the things that I would have to do with those people, especially early on, was, people were going into debt, their assets were wiped out. The AFC curriculum was really helpful, broadening my perspectives. And I would start working with these people, and just the things I remember just from the exam, where we're talking about active listening, reflecting back. Those things were so helpful in communicating with people and getting them to a point where they would actually take my advice. A lot of people, and in fact, in most states, the financial expert of choice is a CPA, and the CPAs come in and they know how to fix the problem. They know how to assess the situation. And so they come in and they're very prescriptive and they don't listen to the client. Sometimes what's optimal is not what's best. What's financially optimal is not what's best. So, that enabled me to be somebody who was able to connect, financial planning to the counseling portion of it. And I actually started giving talks to lawyers and saying, hey, look, you guys are doing this all wrong. You need to be talking to people about how they feel, what they need, their backgrounds, figuring out how they got there, and then so that you can help figure out where they're going. And so that I ended up doing a lot of work in the divorce part of, the financial part of divorce. That's kind of how I got into it. I feel like there are a lot of skills that financial counselors can learn from CFP professionals, and there's definitely a lot that CFP professionals can learn from ASCs. It definitely put me in a position to where I was able to understand, I would call it the right way, or at least a right way to work with clients.
Mike, I think that your experience with communication is not uncommon. I think a lot of times planners or anyone in financial services can get into it and recognize, like, I may know the technical side and I know how to calculate something, but do I really know how to communicate that at the end of the day? And that's really been a big pivot, I think, for the industry. So recently, the CFP board has added financial psychology to its practice standards and tests. And this is a big shift in the industry. Kind of help us figure out how this change is going to affect not only the future of financial planning, but counseling, therapy as well.
It's really what we should have been doing, and not just the CFP board, but the industry in general. It's what we should have been looking at for a long time. When there's a difference between, people go to business school, they get degrees in finance, you learn all the calculations, you learn how to use your trusty financial calculator, and then, you think you're just going to go fix problems. And that's fine in corporate finance, it's fine. And because you want to give your boss the optimal answer. But when you work with people, it's personal finance, it's very personal. And you have to have that connection with people. I think, more and more with technology advancing, the less of the day to day, the calculations, the estimations are going to be done by software. To truly connect solutions to people's needs requires that human median. And if you don't have the financial psychology skills, then you're at risk of being irrelevant. Um, and so I think that as people talk a lot about artificial intelligence, and we're nowhere near what it seems like everybody keeps saying, but we have software is continually improving and can make a financial planner's life more efficient. But the reality is the financial planning piece, the actual number crunching and idea generating is, while important, is less time consuming than the actual connection with the person or couple or family that you're working with. And where are you going to spend the bulk of your effort? You're going to spend the bulk of your effort learning things that help you connect with your client, where you're going to spend the most of your time. And the reality is solutions that you may see from the beginning, that may not be even close to what somebody needs. Even things like, people say they want, when we talk about goals, you know I think we run into what happens with people like goals values mismatch, where somebody might have a goal of retiring at 65. That's an artificial construct. People just, they say that because they hear that, well, that's when you're supposed to retire, or that's when, Social Security kicks in. So it's an artificial construct, but we don't know that that necessarily aligns with their values. And so if somebody comes in with their goals in mind, like, hey, I've got my goals ready, I know what I want to do, and you haven't determined, as a financial planner, you haven't determined whether that actually aligns with their values, I mean, that can create a ton of downstream problems. So the psychology piece of it is getting to those true needs, getting to the values of the couple, and then helping to resolve any of a couple, if it's a couple, resolving any conflicts between the couple. But then also, for if it's just an individual, that person is probably conflicted inside. They have, conflicts that those have to be resolved. And that requires somebody who understands the human condition and who can empathize and who can connect. And those are the skills that you learn in financial psychology of financial planning.
In your current role as research director at CFP Board, what are some of the things that you're looking into now? You mentioned that research lights you up. So what is lighting you up?
The major project that we're working on here is what we call the client impact study. And that's, we don't know empirically whether what we do as financial planners actually improves the lives of people. We think it does. And, each financial planner will say, at least anecdotally, that they're probably improving the lives of clients. But, there are two things there. One is, are we having an impact? Are we having a positive, meaningful impact? And then how do we measure it? Past studies attempt to look at it from a basis points perspective, right? So if you provide X amount of services, your value as an advisor adds 2 to 3% to the total return on people's investments. And that's investments is one dimension, and it's very one dimensional. And when we think about the benefits that financial planning can provide, it's so multidimensional. You do one thing in one direction and it affects something in three other directions, and so on and so forth. And so you can't just look at it from an investment perspective. Now that part is important. I don't want to dismiss that. Also, by the way, I don't want to dismiss the technical skills that are required to be a financial planner. I still think that those are necessary. But investments are a big piece of it. But there are so many. Domains of financial planning include, risk management. They include estate planning, bequest intention, and all of those. And then there are all the crisis events. There's divorce, there's premature death, there's all sorts of things that require pivoting and planning. So we have the planning part, which is, we know some things about, what's deterministic. Like we're going to say, we're going to do these things and then we'll have these outcomes. And then we have that random component that hits you from all directions. And so you can't just look at it from this investment perspective. And it would be great if we can quantify that value so that when we're having conversations with clients, I mean, the service that we provide as financial planners is often is very vague, right? It's, hey, well, we're providing you these things and it's going to cost you X. And if I'm a client, I want to know what the value is. And so that's the major important work we're doing. And then the idea is to look at it longitudinally, so we're not just taking a snapshot and happens to be a good year when we collect the data. We want to see how this evolves over time, how people as they move up the wealth chain or down the wealth chain for that matter, how it changes from the perspective of their well-being and their happiness across a number of dimensions. So we do want to look at it objectively. We want to look at the investments. We want to look at retirement preparedness, insurance preparedness, et cetera. But we also want to examine those emotional, good feeling components. And so that's the big project. You know, I also, really care about the efficacy of what we do. So, an example would be one of the studies that I was working on prior to coming to CFP Board was we talk about emergency funds all the time, but do we have any evidence that they actually provide a much needed boost? We think they do. It's if you look at it, it seems to be the people who need the emergency funds can't really afford to create one, and the people who don't need the emergency funds have an excess of money and they don't need to fund one either. So does it make sense from a financial planning perspective to do that? And there are a ton of other rules of thumb that we use that, are they effective? Do they provide value to clients? Do they provide, long-term financial resilience? And I think in a lot of cases we don't know the answer. We think we know, and in most cases it makes sense. We use logic where we don't have evidence, and I think that that's fine for the time being. But it'd be really nice if we had a profession that was built on the evidence.
What are some of the ways that you're measuring those emotional changes? So, reduce stress or happiness. It's often in research, it's quite easy to measure the numbers, but what are some of the ways that you're looking at those other metrics?
It's still early stages. We actually just, we had our first research team meeting last month. We meet every week now, and one of the things that we're, like you said, it's really easy. We know the objective measures, but the but the hard part is, okay, well, how are we going to, first of all, what are the expected outcomes that a client should have? And then, how can we measure that? I mean, there is a happiness index that we could, draw from. There's financial well-being scale that we can draw from uh, CFPB's definition. So there's a lot of different ways we can go about measuring that. Uh, but a lot of this it boils down to how somebody feels about, the relationship has value, right? The planner client relationship has value. So how do we measure the value there? One of the things we're looking at is trust. One of our researchers, Dr. Emily Kushels, she said that it sticks with me now because it was so profound. She said, when volatility exists, trust becomes fragile. And I thought that's just really, so if you think about it over time, there's always, we have so many volatile events that happen in our lives. And if you don't have that strong trust up front, that can be a problem. And that can be that can result in a poor outcome. So a client could not believe what you say and then, make a poor financial decision, and then they have a worse outcome. So, trust is a component. So we're thinking through all the different components of what would be, impactful from an outcome perspective.
So, Mike, I know from a researcher standpoint, there's so many researchers right now shaking their heads and agreeing, but I would want you to help me understand from a practitioner standpoint, or maybe someone who doesn't understand why research is so foundational to financial services. Can you help explain why we need research and why this is so important to the success of our industry as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first, this sounds like I pulled it out of a a sayings book, but you know, you can't build a profession on anecdotes. And that's kind of what we do, right? Hey, I have this client and this thing worked for them. And so I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that with my next client. Um, or I heard X and that means I need, we, I'm going to give you just an example because I think it makes sense. I saw somebody yesterday said something about they wanted to, I'm not going to call the person out by name, but because I think their intention is good. They only want to work with people in their 50s who are, into a specific type of exercise because and why do they want to help them plan? Because they're going to live longer. But the funny thing about that is that for the most part, if you're going to live longer than average, it's not epigenetic. It has to do with your genes. So your genes are going to help you live longer. So it doesn't matter what sort of exercise program you have. So intention was good, but he's basing his practice off of faulty information. Uh, and so what you really want to be looking at is, okay, well, what are the factors that affect retirement outcomes? What are the factors that will encourage somebody to save? How can we motivate people? So like, for example, from psychology standpoint, because those are the things that are going to lead to those better outcomes. And if you don't have the data to back it up, you're basically just shooting from the hip. And you don't know, like something may have worked for a specific person, and there may be some variable that you haven't considered. You think it's you think it's your you think it's your intervention, but there may be other factors. And so that's really why it's important to research it, because you may do something, this is where it can be dangerous. Like you could do something for a different person and then your outcome could be completely flawed. And then you're trying to figure out why it is. And then, maybe you end up losing the client, maybe they end up, having, poor financial outcomes. So you want to have research so that it's, that you can guide your clients in the right way that's specific. That's why, and I think this is really important for, people say, well, you can't use, a lot of people will say, well, you can't use research for your clients because it's all personal. Everybody's situation is different. But that's exactly why you need research, because there are going to be some commonalities between people that will give you, a a better picture on how you should guide them. That doesn't mean you shouldn't pivot and you shouldn't consider their individual, very, very individual circumstances. But it's really, you want to start with the evidence, right? So it's incredibly, it can be dangerous if you don't use it, and it can be really helpful if you do use it.
Mike, what advice would you give to students or career changes who are wanting to build a solid footing in this field, whether it be financial planning or financial counseling? They want to help people and they want to build strong relationships. Where should they start?
Well, get some relationship skills first, I think. Don't just look at the numbers. I think listening is the key. Listen more than you talk. I think that is really helpful. Try to, come up with, I mean, if you're trying to build a connection, try to find a way to provide value that's not necessarily, I mean, I hate to say what you're selling, but it's not necessarily what you're selling. Because anytime you provide value, there's usually some sort of exchange of value. Maybe you feel better about it, but in general, that person's going to feel better about it. They're going to be more predisposed to you, to listening to you and taking your advice. I think, talk to people. I would suggest following, some of the major, listen to this podcast. I think would be probably pretty helpful, especially this episode. Um, the FPA has a lot of really good podcasts on the subject, because you get to hear a lot of stories of how people got started, and you get to hear a lot of stories about, some of the problems that people have had to overcome. Follow even the major blogs, Michael Kitz's blog, there's a lot of really good information in those things. And then, see practice and see what's going to work for you. And what I found was, what worked for me is, just talking to people and having, conversations, long, in-depth conversations where it wasn't designed to be transactional. It was designed to learn. It was designed to provide as much value that I could to the other person. I think if anything, if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that there is a ton of value to human connection, and having that connection, and learning how to connect with people and providing being even being vulnerable and providing some of yourself to other people. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, this is not unfounded. In fact, psychology, you'll know well, Mike, Carl Rogers, who focused on person-centered therapy, even said that the relationship between the therapist and the individual is going to be the biggest indicator for change in the client. And I think that easily can be applied to financial planning. The relationship between you and your clients is going to be the biggest indicator of change for them in the future as well. So it's mostly about relationships and how to improve those relationships. That's great points. Mike, at the end of each interview, we ask our guests to share their 2 cents. If you had one piece of advice to leave our listeners, what would it be?
I kind of get beaten up about this a little bit, but I think my advice is to dream big. Start as big as you can, and then start to you pare it down. So don't start with, I can't do that. Start with, anything's possible. The caveat that you're going to do that, but you're going to you're going to look at it critically. And I would say early in my life, I was very much a dream big and anything is possible sort of thing. And, I would say, failing helped with that, but it would be better, or at least maybe you would have a quicker route to success if you dreamt big, but then started thinking about it critically, invited others to provide their feedback. Feedback is huge for life. And so, people that you trust to do that, but dreaming big, start there. Don't start with, it can't be done.
Mike, something you mentioned offline that circles back to that idea of dreaming big is the idea that everyone can be a researcher, and you really have that lens. Even with the big dreams, it's, taking a step back, asking the important questions, and most importantly, asking for feedback, not working in a vacuum. And when we do those things, when we're intellectually curious and we ask the questions and we use our listening skills, that's when those big dreams become reality.
That's true. You said it better than I could.
I don't know about that. Well, Mike, for our listeners of the show, tell us where they can connect with you.
Well, so I am on LinkedIn. Happy to connect with anybody, really. You can email me at my CFP Board email address. I also do some travel. In fact, I'm giving some psychology of financial planning CE in May. It'll be in Raleigh, Charlotte, Atlanta, and Nashville.
Well, thanks, Mike.
No problem. Thank you.
Rachel, I really appreciate having Mike on. I think it's really important we talk about research, and I love his perspective from such a global level that he's able to explain not just why his research is important, which I think he did a great job on, but mostly why research is foundational for our entire industry to be able to start with that evidence-based practice. He said a couple of things that really resonated with me. One was you have to start with the evidence. And I thought he gave a great example of what happens when you're only built on anecdotal. I know from some of the worlds that I've come from, the examples are, well, that's how everyone does it. And that's not necessarily true. I think it's really important that research is pivotal to inform better decision-making for us as a whole on an industry level and us as individuals in practice or in counseling with clients. And then he talked a lot about the importance of relational skills, which just made me so happy and excited from a financial counseling point of view, because that's what we do. That's what we excel at, right? And that's what I think is so important to talk about more, because not all CFPs know these skills. And I think that marriage between an AFC and a CFP, which he discussed, is vital to be able to give holistic advice and be able to understand the relational side just as much, if not more, than you understand even the technical advice. He even said it, most of the work's going to be done by computers or AI in the future, but those relationships can't be replaced. And that's what really makes you human. It's the human side of advice.
Yeah, Mary, I agree. And he brings such a unique lens as a researcher, too, because he has that research background, but he has the practical experience in the field. And he's gone through the AFC program, he's been a CFP, and he's seen a lot of those foundational skills around listening and empathy and understanding, those counseling skills that are so critical when working with a client. Personal finance is not one size fits all, but there are so many things that we can learn to build those threads to better support our clients. Hopefully, we will hear again from Mike in the fall with the AFCPE Symposium. For those who are listening today, the invitation to present is open, and so we encourage you, whether you have research or practical applications or initiatives that are working, to visit afcpe.org, submit a presentation for the symposium, and join us this November in New Orleans.